The United Nations is facing a cash flow crisis so severe that it could impact its operations and staff payroll. But is this a symptom of a deeper crisis facing the organization? And what will it take to save it from bankruptcy? Hello and welcome to Bigger Than Five with me, Rida Fakhri. The United Nations says it is quickly running out of cash because many of its member states have not paid their annual contributions. With just over 70% of contributions to the UN's regular budget paid, member states still owe the organization $1.2 billion for this year. More than 130 million people across the world rely on humanitarian assistance and protection from the UN. The United States, which is the UN's largest contributor, recently paid the organization $180 million to relieve some of its financial pressure, but still owes close to $1 billion. Calling it the UN's deepest deficit of the decade, Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned that the international organization's work and reforms are at risk if member states do not pay their contributions in full. So just how bad is the UN's cash crisis? Ais Howdari has our 5 facts.
The United Nations regular budget assessed that $2.85 billion comes with an outstanding balance of $1.2 billion. The UN says it needs to receive at least $808 million by the end of 2019 to keep operations going without interruption. 59 countries have yet to pay their full contributions. That list includes the US, Brazil, Argentina, Iran, Israel, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. At the top of the list is the US, which makes up 22% of the UN's regular budget. It owes $494 million for the 2019 regular budget and $381 million for previous regular budgets. The UN has a separate budget for peacekeeping operations. Out of the $8 billion needed, the amount outstanding is $3.7 billion. Among the countries who have not contributed this year are the US, Brazil, Spain, France, and the Ukraine. The UN budget for international tribunals is estimated to be $90 million. However, the budget has been left with an outstanding balance of $76 million. The United States, Russia, Brazil, and Venezuela, among others, have also not paid their share. With the lack of financial resources, the UN says it could miss payroll for its employees. In the meantime, to save money, the UN has put a freeze on new hires, after-hour meetings or late-night receptions at UN headquarters. There's no more optional travel, no new furniture or replacement computers unless necessary. There are also fewer translations. The UN is also limiting heating and air conditioning between 6 p.m. and 8 a.m. and shutting down escalators and decorative water fountains.
So, will these money-saving measures be enough to keep the UN afloat? For more on the UN's financial crisis, I'm joined by Stefan Dujarric, spokesperson for the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Stefan Dujarric, the Secretary General, says he is introducing these so-called extraordinary measures. But let's face it, will it be enough to make up the $1 billion deficit the UN faces?
Well, you know, the measures everybody keeps talking about is obviously what people see in the building, the escalators, the air conditioning. But the big problem for us right now are the measures we've had to put off in terms of strengthening our IT equipment, construction and strengthening of some of our special political missions. So there's some critical things that we've had to put off. You know, right now we're going to make the November payroll, which is always good news. We will also, the Secretary General will keep putting the pressure on. We do hope that member states, those who haven't yet paid in full, will pay up, but we remain in a critical phase.
To my knowledge, the UN has faced cash crises in the past, but never has a UN Secretary General said to the staff members that they may not get their next paycheck. Are you saying you'll get paid next month?
Yes, and you know, it's important to remember this is not about the staff getting paid. It's about the UN being able to do its work, implement its mandate. The Secretary General has been managing this not just for the last month when it's been a crisis, but really since the start of the year when we have been reducing expenditures wherever we can. And in fact, if we hadn't done it early on in January and February, we may not have been able to hold the General Assembly in September. So this is something we've been doing for quite some time, but obviously we always in the fall face a crunch, but this year has been especially difficult.
You say it's something that you've been doing for a while, but the reality is that it's something that you, the United Nations, the Secretary General, has known for at least the past 2 years, that the Trump administration was not going to pay its dues. That was crystal clear, yet he waited till midnight to sound the alarm bells. Why didn't he do something about it earlier?
This is not about the United States or the Trump administration. We have been used to the U.S. Calendar, which always means that the U.S. pays later in the year. The UN has known this. We budget for that. The problem is that now other countries and bigger countries are also paying late. The U.S. has made a number of partial payments recently. We expect more. There is no indication that the United States will not honor its commitments to paying its dues. The problem is that other countries now have the same model of paying late. And that is where our crisis is really is right now.
Sure, but your crisis, you and I both know, is due to one member state alone that owes $1 billion out of the $1.2 billion owed to the United Nations. So talking about the other member states or sending a letter to lay collective blame on the doorstep of every member state doesn't make sense, does it? Isn't the SG again dancing around, cutting corners, and not addressing the core issue, the elephant in the room?
We're not dancing around anything. The reality is, as I've said, the U.S. has always paid late. Yes, the U.S. has arrears, but we're talking about the operational budget of the UN. The U.S. has always paid later in the year. This year, they're doing it as well. As I said, we've gotten some partial payments from them. Indications are that more funds will be coming. But you have countries like Brazil, which hasn't paid this year. You've had Mexico, which made partial payments, Venezuela. And so these are large contributors. The structural problem that we have in the cash flow is that the General Assembly or the Security Council creates new missions, new projects for the UN. Let's say, to take an example, the program the UN has put in Hodeidah in Yemen. But we have to pay for that out of this year's budget, even though it is not actually budgeted or assessed. So we have to pay in advance.
Sure, but would you be in this situation had the United States paid its full share? After all, it pays 22%, or at least it owes 22% of the regular budget. Some criticize the United Nations leadership for being too lenient with powerful countries like the US, in fact, for even being, some would say, subservient. Is that a fair enough characterization, do you think?
It is not a characterization we share. The Secretary General has been really from day one when he took office been very, very careful about spending money. One of the first orders he put out was a cutback on air travel and the use of non-commercial aircraft. The issue for us is not one member state. It is other member states not paying.
Well, yes, but the Secretary General sent a letter, I have a copy of it, just a few weeks ago to all member states. I just wonder, did he send a specific letter to the United States President to say you must pay up, given the fact that if the US doesn't pay, it makes a huge hole in your budget?
We have been in touch with the State Department. We have been in touch with the US mission. And as I said, they have made partial payments. All the indications are that we've received is that more money will be coming. But there are other countries that owe substantial amount of money that have not yet paid.
Well, and one of the ways your boss, the Secretary General, says he wants to manage the budget is by, as you say, doing little things here and there, stopping escalators, turning off water fountains. He also said that he would restrict travel to, quote, the most essential trips only. Is he implicitly acknowledging that a number of high-ranking UN officials are making non-essential trips, junkets?
No, that's not what he's doing. They're always, if you have travel planned, you could always see if you could do a video conference. There are always ways to do a bit less and spend a lot less.
It isn't just about cutting the cost, as you say, through some of the non-essential travel, as the Secretary General calls it, but it's also about the image it projects when the Secretary General of the United Nations, and it's been documented, has taken many trips to his home country, Portugal, on the back of other official visits. He spent several days there. Does that send the right image?
The Secretary General's travel spending compared to others is drastically lower. The delegations that go with the Secretary General used to be up to 10 or 15 people. Now it's 3 or 4 people.
But this is non-essential travel, though, is it?
The travel he does to go home on a round trip is done at his own cost. If, in fact, we can talk travel agency booking, but if you look at the way TAP Air Portugal does its travel, it's cheaper to travel to Europe through Lisbon than to take non-direct flights. So in fact, he has been saving money. And I can tell you, he is the first person to try to save costs wherever we can.
I'm not sure how that saves costs, though, Stefan Dujarric. I'd expect you to say this, but there are instances of 20 documented trips at least, and about 30 stopovers in Lisbon that have lasted a few days. And this, you might say, it cuts costs, but it actually ends up always having a few additional hidden costs that have to do with staff members having to travel with him, security detail, as we know as well, traveling with him in first class.
Frankly, it doesn't. I mean, we can look at on Google Flight, but if you're traveling from New York to Geneva nonstop on a certain airline, and you look at the cost of traveling New York to Geneva via Lisbon, it is cheaper to travel through Lisbon. So that's the basic fact that anybody can look at on Expedia or any other travel website.
To be fair, it isn't just the Secretary General, the Deputy Secretary General as well, and other heads of UN agencies have been accused of taking too many flights that are not always seen as essential. But having said that, how do you see the UN getting out of this crisis?
Well, we see it by some of the member states that owe us the most money paying up before December. That's the way we will get out of this current crisis. There is a structural crisis which the member states need to address about how the budget is drawn up and the way the Secretary General is allowed to allocate the budget. So we're working with member states to address the structural issues in the budget process that will allow us to avert crises like these in the future.
All right, Stefan Dujarric, spokesperson for the UN Secretary General, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us. The United Nations liquidity problems are nothing new. For years, the international body has struggled to meet all its financial needs. For the second year in a row, the UN has exhausted all its regular budget reserves and has managed to stay afloat with money left over from its closed peacekeeping missions. But just like the regular budget, the UN's peacekeeping budget is also seriously underfunded. Now, there are currently 13 active UN peacekeeping operations around the world. One of them is United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon. It monitors the border between Lebanon and Israel. We went to South Lebanon to see how UNIFIL's work contributes to regional peace and security.
UNIFIL is probably one of the largest peacekeeping operations, as I said, with over 10,500 troops, but also with 44 troop contributing countries, and the only peacekeeping operation with a naval component that no one else has. We have over 14,000 operational activities per month. Food patrols, vehicle patrols, helicopter patrols, night patrols throughout the area of operations. So it's a pretty robust peacekeeping operations that is working along the blue line to ensure that there is no violation of the line of withdrawal, which is the line of withdrawal of the IDF troops in the year 2000, but also that the situation in the Sound has been kept stable. And as I said, last 13 years the situation has been calm.
اليونيفيل بنشوفهم بدوريات بيبرموا هيك بيبرموا بهالضياع وبيروحوا بيجوا دوريات هني وجيش اللبناني احيانا واحيانا لحالهم هني كمان في مراقبه في لهم في فرقه مراقبه وبضل بالنسبه لهني ارتباط بين الجيش اللبناني والعدو الاسرائيلي بضلوا دوريات شغلتهم هاي حفاظ على الامن بمساعده الجيش اللبناني
دائما دوريات للنهار يعني هم عندهم دورة زي ما بيعملوا دوريات للنهار ضمن المنطقة كلها الحزام الأمني هون نعتبر بالحزام الأمني من الليطاني ولتحت يسمونه الحزام الأمني بكل جنوب يونيفيل مش بس بمنطقتنا هون بارك الله فيهم يعني عم يخدمونا
نرجع مثل أيام الاحتلال حرب بلاد فلتانة بتصير لأنه الدولة ما كانت قادرة تبسط شرعيتها هون بوجود الاحتلال. خاصة نحن قبل الاحتلال كمان كانت عندنا منطقة على طول منطقة تعبانة، نحن بعد عن إسرائيل، عن حدود إسرائيل حدود فلسطين أقل من كيلومتر، يعني إذا بقوس رصاصة كانت تيجي على الضيعة.
يعني بصير مشاكل كثير على الحدود بين لبنان وإسرائيل. يعني بتعرف الونف اللي بيهضوا الوضع شوي، عاملين لهم حواجز، لهم دوريات، لهم مراكز، يعني بيضلوا يحلوا مشكل، موجودين للأمن هون مش أكثر.
At the end, the amount of money that each member state is paying to UNIFIL compared to what the cost would be of a conflict in the area is not even comparable. So whatever has been done until now, especially in UNIFIL, with 13 years of unprecedented stability, is something that we need to build on, and member states understand how important it is to keep this particular region stable.
So then, if the United Nations is such an essential organization, why does it continue to struggle to meet its financial needs? I'm joined by Brett Schaefer, member of the UN's Committee on Contributions and fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and from New York, Munir Akram, Pakistan's ambassador to the UN. Ambassador Akram, you know the United Nations extremely well, having served under Kofi Annan and now being back under Secretary General Guterres. The Security Council decides on the deployment of UN peacekeeping missions around the world, yet two of its permanent members, France and the United States, are in arrears when it comes to the UN's peacekeeping budget. In your experience, what does this tell us about the way the United Nations operates?
I think as far as peacekeeping is concerned, there is a slight disconnect. Because once the Security Council decides to deploy a contingent under Chapter 7 of the Charter, it is an obligation on all member states concerned to contribute to the financing of that operation. So holding back payments from peacekeeping operations, or indeed for assessed contributions, is contrary to the purposes of the Charter and the obligations of member states.
And it isn't just, of course, the peacekeeping budget, but Brett Schaefer, as we say, the regular budget, the United States contributes 22% towards that budget. This is the scale of assessment. It follows a very complicated formula that essentially takes into account a country's economy, in terms of size, as well as its population, and other factors as well. Should the United Nations be receiving this amount from the US? Is that fair as an assessment?
Well, I think what we need to highlight, perhaps for your viewers who don't know this, the discrepancy in the level of contributions between the member states. For instance, the United States is assessed, as you mentioned, almost 28% of the peacekeeping budget, 22% of the regular budget. The least assessed countries in the United Nations system are assessed 0.001% of the regular budget and 0.0001% of the peacekeeping budget. In dollar terms, the United States is charged almost $3 billion per year for the United Nations. The least assessed member states are charged less than $37,000.
Given the amount that it pays to the organization, should you welcome the idea of the United States actually paying less than 22%?
The payments are proportionate to the size of the economy, the population, and capacity to pay. This is an equitable formulation to which the United States has agreed. And of course, this entails large responsibilities for the US, and that it has a right to oversee that the money is spent well. But those mechanisms of oversight are built into the United Nations, and the United States has the ability to oversee them, to supervise their expenditure within the system. Withholding money that is obligated under the Charter is not, in my view, not the right way to secure reform at the United Nations or its payment system or its operation.
Brett Schaefer, your reaction, not the right way.
Yeah.
And the United States, back in the 1970s, in fact, had the opportunity to accept a proposal that was floated back then to pay less. It refused. Today, it says it wants the opposite because I presume it is such an important power in the world that it can dictate whatever it wants, even if it paid less.
Well, the history of the United States and its payments to the United Nations is pretty long. The ambassador may know this, but back when the United Nations was actually being negotiated in San Francisco, the United States insisted, and the U.S. Senate insisted, that the United States not pay more than 25% to the organization. And it agreed reluctantly to pay that at the beginning because of the damage done to a number of economies after World War II. But that's always been a goal of the United States, dating back to the very beginning of the organization. And in terms of the practice of withholding money to the UN, the United States didn't start that practice. It was actually France and Russia and another number of other countries that refused to pay in the 1960s for two substantial UN peacekeeping operations, one in Egypt, UNEF, and the other in the Congo.
But
and we only got that because we got...
It still doesn't make up, though, for the fact that the U.S. owes the United Nations today, as we speak, almost $1 billion for this year alone. Ambassador Akram, what about the criticism of other countries as well? Some people will argue that China, its share of the global economy is about 14%, yet it only pays 8% of the regular budget. Is that fair criticism?
Yes, firstly, let me say that two wrongs do not make a right. As far as the formula, the formulas keep changing every year. China was paying 3%, now it pays 8%, and I expect that the Chinese contribution will increase over time as the indicators that are used in the GNI are reviewed and new numbers of GDP, population, etc. come forward. China will indeed have to pay more and will pay more. In this crisis, they are apparently willing to advance 2 years payment to the United Nations in order to bail itself out of this crisis that has been created.
And it isn't just the financial crisis that the UN is facing, of course. Many would argue that it's also its moral standing that's at stake. Many view this organization, including many human rights institutions, view it as increasingly reluctant to take on the big wealthy powers. Not just the United States, but countries like Saudi Arabia, in the face of their ongoing onslaught on Yemen, that it is refusing, that its Secretary General refuses to take on these powers and to name and shame countries that he perhaps should.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting point you raise up. The ambassador probably knows this. The United Nations General Assembly just voted Venezuela onto the Human Rights Council. So if you're talking about the reputational damage of the organization, you can point directly to an instance like that, where you're electing one of the world's worst human rights abusers to sit on the premier human rights body in the organization. And of course, at the same time, you also have China, Cuba, Russia, and other countries on that Human Rights Commission.
Ambassador Akram, to you finally, when you look at the evolution of the United Nations throughout the years from one Secretary General to the other, how do you see the situation? Do you see a steady erosion of the moral standing of this organization?
I think that the whole process of multilateralism, the idea of cooperative solutions, has eroded, and I think there are many culpable members of the United Nations for this, for a lesser and higher degree. But precisely how to have influence in the United Nations? Do we do it by coercion, or do we do it by example? I think the United States is expected to lead by example. And even if we have bad situations or adverse situations, the United States could have taken, in my view, a more cooperative, supportive course of action in order to influence the United Nations and the majority of its members.
Certainly a challenging time for the United Nations. Ambassador Munir Akram, Brett Schaefer, thank you both very much indeed for joining us. The power of the purse has often been used even at the UN. The US also withheld its contributions in the 1990s. The difference, though, is that the current Secretary General has sought to appease President Trump even after he withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement and the Iran nuclear deal. Appeasement may have been worth a try, but clearly it hasn't worked. Not only has the US refused to pay the bulk of its share, it has also managed to slash the UN regular budget by $250 million. It is certainly a delicate balancing act for the UN leadership, but the organization's future will depend not just on its ability to fund itself, but on its willingness to stand up to its most powerful member states, even if that means its host country, the United States. From me, Rida Fakhri, and all the team here in Washington, thanks for watching. See you next time.